Hello, this is Paweł from DevOps Codes Academy. Welcome to another lesson. Today we will do introduction into Docker containers. Please subscribe our channel. Don't forget to visit our Facebook group, DevOps Codes Academy. Also, if you like, don't forget to leave the thumb up and also some nice comments or maybe thoughts. What would you like to learn about? All right, so let's jump to the console and talk a little bit about Docker containers. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what is a container and how it's compared to a virtual machine or to your laptop. So when you are working on your computer, you have your hardware and you have your host operating system. It might be Windows, it might be a Macintosh, it might be some Linux distribution like Ubuntu, for example. So what we can do on our computer, on our laptop, or our PC, we can install some hypervisor which will allow us to manage virtual machines, right? And I think the most popular for users will be VirtualBox, where, for example, you could have a virtual machine on your computer. Also, on Windows now you can, for example, install Ubuntu with WSL, right? So this is kind of virtualization. So usually a virtual machine, and we can find it also in data centers, that will be a separate operating system, right? We will have a guest OS and then we can have some applications installed there. So the virtual machine usually is quite big. It contains the whole kernel of the operating system. So we have to point out the storage for it. We have to define how much resources we want to give to it. So when we go to containers, you can see that we have a host operating system of our PC, of our server in the data center. Then we have container engine. And for example, when we are using Docker, so we can have our Docker desktop, I will show you in a moment, and our containers. So containers, as you can see here, they will not contain an operating system. So for example, like we could work with Windows and Ubuntu on one hardware. So here, if I'm using a MacBook, I would not be able to run Windows containers. I can run containers based on Unix systems. And containers, they are much lighter. So we will show you for example, a small image based on Alpine that is very small, and it's much easier to move between hosts. So the idea of using Docker images and containers here, it's that we can pre-pack some application, some configuration, and we can easily run on multiple machines, right? So it's also much easier to restore our application, or if you build a stateless application, so then we can have a auto-scaling group of our containers. So once again here, if we take a look, so the virtual machine will have the OS kernel included. It's much bigger. And on the right side, when you look at containers, there will be only OS kernel of the hardware, and then we will only pack application layer. So right, I recommend you to go, for example, through this documentation. You can find a little bit more on the internet as well. So to work today with me, I would recommend you to go to Google, for example, type Docker install, and then you can go to Docker documentation, and depends on which OS you are using. Please download and install Docker Desktop for Mac, either for Windows, either install it for Linux. Hopefully you will go through it. As a DevOps or cloud engineer, it is recommended, and it's a good skill to go through the documentation. If you have any problems, of course, please let me know. in a comment. All right, so I have my Docker already installed, Docker desktop on my MacBook. We can see that we can run some application here, but I would like to take you to the Visual Studio Code and let's go through some basic commands, right? So as you can see here, Docker PS will show any running containers right now, and I have no containers running at the moment. So I would like to give you a small example today of usage. So if I go and see the version of my Python 3, it's 3.10.9, right? And for example, I would be a Python developer, or I would be just a DevOps engineer working with some Python project. So what I would like to achieve here is that we might be working with a different versions of Python, right? And then we would have to install different versions of Python. It is possible. There are tools like pyenv for that, to test it locally. But what we can do, we can find a Docker image with a version of Python that we need, right? So if we go, and there's a Docker Hub. It's a public hub where people are pushing their images, and they are private. They are also verified. So if we look for Python here, and you see that this is a Docker official image, a lot of downloads, a lot of stars, means that it's quite, I would say, maybe not safe to use it, but because there are always some vulnerabilities around. So of course the security team will be very concerned always for us to pay attention for what we are using. And you can see here that we have a tag, and tag will be representing, in our case, the version of Python. So we can see that there's 3.12, 3.11. There's the same one that I'm using. And the part of the tag also, that will be a Linux distribution. It's not so important for us right now. So my version of Python is 10.10.9. So let's try to run 10.11.1. So Docker cannot find this image locally. It will pull it from the Docker Hub. We can see it right now. And I will show you a difference so you can see how many megabytes is download right now. Because we are pulling 3.11 and we can see the tags are going through them. This Buster, I tried to find 3.11. I would just want to show you the difference between the regular 3.11.1 and the 3.11.1 Slim, for example. Let me find here 3.11. Okay, it's not here. Maybe we can find it here also, because there are only examples. Slim Buster. Oh yeah, that's the one. So you can see this one is 340 megabytes. It's the same as a Bullseye, but we can also find that there's a Slim one which is only 46 megabytes, and we would be able to run it locally, and I will show you in a second. Okay, so the image, and when we do not provide any command, that will be a different lesson a little bit later on, but let's try to run it once again with IT flag interactive, and now we are in the Python, right? don't go too much into details right now if you are using Docker for the first time. And we can print hello here, right? And we can do any commands that we want. And you can see that the Python is 3.11. So we can also go back. We can find a 3.12 0A4, and let's try to use the slim one, for example. So I will just copy this, go back. All right. We are pulling, and you see that this image is much smaller once again. And the version of Python is different. That's the leverage of Docker. What if we try to run it and add entry point? Don't remember if it, yeah. So what we do, we override, because the default entry point for those images is Python. It's ready to go to run Python commands, but we can override it with the command of shell. So now we are inside this Docker container, and we can perform like on this, let's call it operation system, right? But this is not a virtual machine, it's a container that is acting as a separate operating system from my MacBook right now. So we are at the root. Let's go to the root folder, right? Oops. ls, nothing here. We can create a folder. We can, right? We can do whatever we want. But if we go out of this container and we will run again, we will have a new container right now. So that's the clue here to understand that we have one image, but we can have multiple containers of this image. We can have multiple instances, nodes, whatever we called it, but each one will be a different one. I will just show you. If we go back to the root, you see it's nothing here. But if we go to Docker, and you see that those are the containers that I was running. And we can take a look and we can see the histories of the commands that they were executed. So this one is where I was creating the folder and the file. We will go in another lesson to a little bit more details, but what we can do, we can run it, and we can run it from here, and we can attach to the terminal here. So we are again at the root of this container. Let's go to the folder root, and you see the file and the folder is here. So that's the biggest challenge for me. It was the biggest one when I was learning about it, that we can have one image, which is kind of a recipe, right? It's something that it's containing already some instructions. And then we can have multiple containers of it, and each one will be a different one. They have a different random names, but we can also provide the name for it when we run it. So let's go back, Docker run, and we can add a name here, my Python container 1, and I'm inside. And we go back to Docker desktop, and we see that the green one is running here, and you see that the name is here. Also, each container will have its unique ID. So if we go open a new terminal here, you can use it. The same thing we can do in the command line, that's very useful to be very familiar with those commands, because many times we have to SSH to some different virtual machine when there's Docker running, and we have to do some operations on the Docker containers, for example. But locally, for the first time, it's also very nice for you to go and take a look a little bit here, right? What we can do. So you can see that there's the container and it has own ID, and that's the name here. So we can also run a second container with number 2. Right, I'm already in the shell. I can open a new terminal here, Docker PS, and we have 2 containers running right now. And the same we can see in the Docker desktop. So we can also attach to every container from the desktop. So even if I'm here attached to this container, to the second one and the first one, that's the second one, and I attach to the first one here. Okay, so let's create a new dir ls. It's here, go back, that's the one here, ls, and you see that the new dir is already here. That's the basic of the Docker that I would like to show you today. Next lesson, we will write a Docker file. That will be an instruction for us, because now we are using Docker images pre-built by somebody else, and what I would like to teach you, and we're gonna use a Python Flask web application framework for that, because we're gonna connect it together with our AWS ECS service, and we will build our backend service behind application load balancer. So everything that we are doing here, it will build into the one piece, and hopefully you will get a little bit more understanding. Don't be afraid. In the very beginning, it's always a little bit messy, but we will go through it, and hopefully together you will learn a little bit more about Docker images, about DevOps engineering, and we will deploy everything in AWS Cloud. Thank you so much. This is Paweł from DevOps Codes Academy. Don't forget to subscribe our channel. Don't forget to leave a thumb up if you really enjoyed that and you found some value here. You can find us on our social media, and really I recommend you please join our Facebook group, DevOps Codes Academy, where hopefully we can all share with knowledge there. Have a good day, and of course don't forget to stop Docker if you will stop using it. You can also delete those containers, right? We will learn a little bit more about making a good practices while working with Docker.